Okay, I guess that's my cue. Welcome everybody around the virtual table. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I think, I know everybody on the call, so welcome to this global talk, and a very warm welcome to Megan Smith, for doing this today, enlightening us on the Arctic and Russia-Canada relations and so forth. So for today, I think you're all pros by now. I can run over what we want to do today very quickly. However, I first would like to acknowledge, with respect to the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees Kwan Masanj peoples whose historic relationship with the land continue to this day. And I think if I interpret what Megan's going to tell us about, indigenous identities, indigenous traditions also play a major role in the Arctic. And so we will hear a little bit about this today as well, as one of the key stakeholders in redesigning the governments of this sort of often frozen part of the world. So for the etiquette today, please mute your mics and probably also your cameras while we have the presentation, and then we can all come on. In particular, if you raise your hand and I invite you to raise a question, it would be wonderful to see your face. You don't have to, but it's one way to show a little bit more of us and to create the sense of community that we, in a way, long for, dating back to the good old days of meeting in person. So you can see here the presentation will be recorded as well. Here you see just a very quick update on where you find, the chat room, where you raise your hand. But I think by now we're all Zoom pros and know how to use the system. All right, that brings me to the, that's, where we find the recordings in the end. That allows me to introduce Megan Swift, who's currently a CFGS faculty fellow, and she is also housed at UVic as an associate professor in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. And Megan has been working on different aspects of modernity, of trying to understand, the 20th century legacy of crucial expressions of identity, of belonging, of society, with a particular focus on Russia and memory politics in this context. And you see here her latest book, Picturing the Page, Illustrated Children's Literature and Reading Under Lenin and Stalin, came out with the University of Toronto Press, and I think it focuses on this crucial turning point also with the Russian Revolution, with the Soviet Revolution, and what it did to cultural expressions, to modernity at large, looking at Russia. Megan is also currently a guest editor of a special issue with the Canadian Journal of European and Russian Studies, looking at Canada-Russian relations. I suppose the Arctic will give us a lens into this relationship as well. And she's also on the advisory board of the Canadian-Russia Research Initiative that is associated with the center, and has worked on various aspects related to the Arctic, security dimensions and media coverage as well. So it's a great pleasure, Megan, having you at the center as a fellow, but also inviting you now to take the stage and present on your research. And we very much look forward to interacting with you over the year and learn a lot about Russia and Russia-Canadian relationships and the Arctic, today's topic. Megan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Oliver. How is my volume? Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah, you're coming in clear.
That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to start my screen share now so you can see my PowerPoint slides. And here we go. Okay, how does that look for you? Can you see the slides?
I see them.
Yeah, I can see them too.
Coming through good.
Okay. So just a second here, there we go. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction, Oliver. Canada and Russia are two major stakeholders for decisions of global significance on the circumpolar Arctic. And these decisions include disputed national boundaries along sea coasts and for continental shelves, ownership of and access to strategic shipping lanes, the presence of nuclear submarines, ecological preservation through the creation and designation of protected areas, Indigenous territorial and language rights, as well as change patterns of migration and impacts to traditional ways of life. All of these themes impact not just the Arctic regions themselves, but shape a strong sense of Canadian and Russian national sense of self, since both cultural identities are strongly tied to a geographical and imaginary north and far north. And this is something I'm going to be discussing in detail in the talk today. So I want to look at the Arctic as a transnational area that's uniquely capable of moving Canada-Russia relations forward, and that underlines historical context and cultural knowledge as a missing puzzle piece in understanding how to frame future policymaking. Please note as you're looking at my title slide that my title has changed just a tiny little bit, and Indigenous has come out of the title for today, only because I'm just not able to do justice to it in the time that I have for this talk today, but it's an important puzzle piece for this research project, and certainly an important part of it. So this project stems from my work, as Oliver said, with, hold on a second, just a second here. Having some trouble advancing my slide.
I think there are two arrows at the bottom, if you click those.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so this project stems from my work with a new research group at the University of Victoria, as Oliver said, the Canada-Russia Research Initiative, and my collaboration with the CRRI's creator, Anna Turkan, to further the research activities and the outreach of this group. As its name suggests, the Canada-Russia Research Initiative is dedicated to the study of Canada-Russia relations, which since the 2014 annexation of Crimea and subsequent military actions in two Ukrainian regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, and since the 2017 passing of the Magnitsky Act, with the strong backing of then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, and the tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats from both Canada and Russia that ensued after that, since all of these events, the Canada-Russia relations have reached a significant low point. Last fall, the Canada-Russia Research Initiative hosted its first conference, which was dedicated to the themes of Arctic, media, and security. With the support of the Center for Global Studies, thank you very much to the Center, and also Victoria's chapter of the Canada International Council. And thank you very much to the Council and to Chris, who is here today. So some of the experts who presented at the conference were invited to contribute to a special issue of the Canadian Journal of European and Russian Studies, which I'm guest editing as we speak, and it's the contributors are both Canadian and Russian experts, and the issue will come out in December of this year. So through work on the conference and the journal, it quickly became evident that the Arctic actually presented one of the most promising paths for Russia and Canada to move forward in their relations. At this moment in history, when cooperation at a state-to-state level has become increasingly difficult, niche areas of cooperation such as the Arctic play a particularly important role. And this is when Track 2 diplomacy, scientific and scholarly initiatives can step forward to create some momentum. And we need that momentum. Canada and Russia are the so-called geographical giants in the Arctic. That's the term used by Whitney Lackenbauer, who is our Canada Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North, which is housed at Trent University. They are the two leading members of the Arctic Council. Since its inception at Canada's behest in 1996. Other members that you can see here include Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and the United States. Of those 8 Arctic nations, Russia has by far the largest permanent population in the region. There's actually 2.5 million inhabitants in Russia's Arctic as compared to 150,000 in Canada, so quite a population difference. And Russia also has the largest number of different indigenous groups that are living in the Arctic. So Russia has up to 40 different indigenous groups living in the area, including the Nenets, the Evenki, the Chukchi, and others. The states that you see highlighted in blue on this slide are the ones that have Arctic coastlines, and that's going to be significant for the talk today. Canada actually has the longest Arctic coastline in the world. The second longest is Norway, then Russia is third, and Iceland has the fourth longest, and the US actually has the shortest Arctic coastline. Before the cooling of Russia-Canada relations began in 2014, common interests and challenges in the Arctic had already been a productive area of cooperation between our two countries. Since 2014, it remains one of the areas least affected by the crisis in Ukraine. Although the most recent publications on Arctic policy by Russian specialists warn that the longer this crisis goes on, the likelier it is that increased political tensions are going to spill over into our relationship in the Arctic, resulting in more military securitization. At the same time, Canada and Russia have some important common interests and common understandings about the Arctic that can be nurtured and developed. Historically, Canada and Russia have tended to see eye to eye on matters of territorial dispute in the Arctic. Since 1925, both nations have favored a division of territory into what is known as national sectors, which are measured from longitudinal lines drawn from the North Pole. That's a sovereignty claim. That's Canada and Russia's sovereignty claims based on national sectors are disputed by the United States and by Norway. There we go. I see I'm behind by one in my slides. So here we go. In addition, both Canada and Russia support UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. When a nation ratifies this convention, it has 10 years to make territorial claims on an extended continental shelf, as well as exclusive rights to the gas and oil reserves beneath it. Russia ratified UNCLOS in 1997, laying claim to the Lomonosov and Mendeleev ridges, which are incredibly significant. They're the matter of territorial dispute. They were actually discovered by Russia in 1948 and named after two of Russia's greatest scientists and scholars. You probably recognize Mendeleev from, he's the creator of the table of elements. And by laying claim to the Mendeleev and Lomonosov continental shelves, the ridges, Russia is also laying claim to the mineral riches of their seabeds and their subsoil. Canada ratified UNCLOS in 2003, laying claim to a portion of the continental shelf that overlaps in some areas with Russia's claim. But both nations have moved forward in cooperation and submission of their respective claims to the International Commission on the Law of the Sea, with the full intention of honoring the final determination of that commission, whatever it finds. The United States, and this is significant, has yet to ratify UNCLOS, signaling its lack of readiness to submit to bilateral negotiations about territorial designations. Russia supports Canada's position on the touchiest dispute from the Canadian point of view, which is the status of the Northwest Passage. Canada claims the Northwest Passage as its internal waters based on the article of international law that allows for 12 nautical miles adjacent to a coastline to be claimed as territorial waters. With exclusive fishing rights and natural resource extraction, shipping lanes, and submarine activity on the line, it's not only the claim of the United States that the once icebound Northwest Passage constitutes, in fact, international waters that's cause for concern for Canadians, but also the related claims of non-Arctic nations such as China, Japan, and South Korea. From the Russian point of view, the most sensitive territorial dispute is associated with their northern sea route, a claim which is disputed again by the US. The US, as well as China, Japan, and South Korea, would like to revise the legal status of what Canada and Russia claim to be their national waters, with an eye to opening up the Arctic to internationalization in the interests of non-Arctic nations. And it's in this sense that Canada and Russia are allies in the North, even as they remain officially at odds over the crisis in Ukraine. Canada and Russia both support the position that the Arctic Council is a governing body created by Northerners for Northerners before the Arctic was of interest to the rest of the world. That's a quote from a CBC article. As such, Canada and Russia were both cautious with respect to the 2013 granting of observer status on the Council to China, India, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Italy. And they're both allied in their opposition to granting observer status to the European Union, which has been seeking it since 2008. The EU does not support the position that the Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route constitute national territories for Canada and Russia respectively. And this is one of very few issues in which you would find Canada united with Russia's position against both the EU and the US. Nonetheless, these are significant matters that are tied to the core identities of Russia and Canada as Northern peoples. Even our remarkably non-emotional former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, poured his heart and soul and over $1 million into a 6-year project to find the sunken wrecks of the lost Franklin expedition in the Northwest Passage. When one of the wrecks was located in 2014, Harper called it no less than an historic event for Canada. With respect to military security in the Arctic, up until 2014, the chiefs of staff of the military of each Arctic Council member met regularly to ensure mutual confidence that there was no military buildup in the Arctic. But since the crisis in Ukraine, Russia has not been included in those meetings. And Canada does not plan to send a representative to the Arctic Forum that will be hosted in Russia in 2021. So we can see that the tensions emanating from Russia's actions in Ukraine have brought a slight cooling of relations up into the permafrost zone, although there are still examples of ongoing cooperation between the nations in terms of economic and scientific joint ventures in the Arctic. The Canadian government underlined the strategic importance of the Arctic in its 2017 defense policy, Strong, Secure, Engaged. That's the title of our defense policy. And urged both the modernization of longstanding defense partnerships with the United States, like NORAD, and the enhancement of its own Arctic capabilities. Russia has deployed new nuclear weapon systems in the Arctic with long-range capabilities that increase its ability to threaten targets in North America. According to a 2014 report, the Russian North has the largest concentration of nuclear installations, both military and civilian, in the world. As Nancy Teeple, a Fulbright scholar specializing in Arctic security, and also our colleague at the Canada-Russia Research Initiative argues, because of this, Canada may feel pressure to bring its defense policy into alignment with the US in order to enhance the security of our long Arctic coast. At the same time, Canada needs to be strategic in its relations with Russia, since, as political scientist Zach Peiken and another colleague at the Canada-Russia Research Initiative argues, deeper relations between Ottawa and Moscow are essential not only if Canada wishes to manage its northern border, but also if Canada is genuinely interested in becoming a builder of international order in this century, rather than being a mere bystander operating on terms that are set by other countries. What I've outlined so far are the facts and figures on the Arctic from the latest research into bilateral relations and military security. But when it comes to further policy making, it's also critical to understand what Canada and Russia's Arctics represent in the cultural imaginations of each nation, and so create an understanding of what's at stake in the eyes of each country. What narratives have fed into the creation of our northern identities? How do they figure into our sense of place and of self? Which of these narratives draw our two norths together, and which ones distance us from each other? How have these narratives transformed in the 21st century to come in line with new pressures like climate change and globalization? These are the questions that are informing my research project. To say that Canadians identify with the North is a major understatement. The North is not only a symbol, but in 2019, you'll probably recognize this if you are a basketball fan, or even if you're not a basketball fan. In 2019, the North became a battle cry as well as a remarkably successful marketing brand. When we quote our national anthem and say that we are the true North, strong and free, the North denotes both a directional and a moral compass point. The true North, strong and free is a metaphor for our perceived shared values of honesty, authenticity, and self-reliance. In his 1989 novel, Solomon Gursky Was Here, which imagines the title character as the sole survivor of the Franklin expedition, iconic Canadian novelist Mordecai Richler famously said that every Canadian feels a connection with the North, even though very few of us have actually ever been north of 60, never mind setting foot in the Arctic. Despite this, vast icy land and seascapes, dancing aurora borealis, floating icebergs, and midnight sun are all considered to be part of the Canadian birthright. Although for most Canadians, these remain landscapes of the mind and the imagination rather than actual physically experienced landscapes. They're cultural creations produced by poems like The Cremation of Sam McGee by Robert W. Service. It's a poem from 1907. And in the artwork of Ted Harrison. You'll probably recognize it as the artwork of Ted Harrison as the cover art for this edition of The Cremation of Sam McGee, which came out in 1983 by Kids Can Press. We also have a well-known cultural creation in the stirring ballad written by Stan Rogers, Northwest Passage from 1981, which is a song that was chosen by Canadians as their top choice for an alternative national anthem in a 1995 poll. It's an a cappella ballad, very powerful and still sung in pubs throughout the Maritimes at top volume, with its unforgettable imagery of life, both modern and in Franklin's time, as a warm line drawn through a land so wild and savage. The Canadian North, the Canadian Arctic and subarctic is a construct of words, music, and colors that suggest adventure, adversity, wide spaces, bracing air, lonely struggle, and perhaps heroism. And that image in the mind's eye was created almost exclusively by non-Northerners. Therefore, it's not a self-representation. Robert Service, the writer of The Cremation of Sam McGee, and Ted Harrison were both British. Mordecai Richler was an urbane Montrealer, and Stan Rogers was born in Hamilton, Ontario. All of these motifs that I've mentioned are captured in the 1967 experimental film documentary, which was created for the CBC by famous Canadian composer Glenn Gould. He did the script and the sound for the film documentary and also created three so-called sound documentaries in the period after he had given up composition. They're called the Solitude Trilogy, and they were played as radio documentaries. The film documentary, which is titled The Idea of North, is a 4-part series that once again suggests that for Canadians, the North is important as a metaphysical as well as a geographical space. It's the idea of North. The documentary traces a young man's 2-day train journey up to Churchill, Manitoba, which is just 70 kilometers away from the border with Nunavut. And that journey begins with a narrator's voice saying that they can't conceive of anyone who's come in contact with the North not being touched by it for the rest of their lives. It's clear that traveling north means shedding the camouflage and the distractions of your city life to come into closer contact with your inner self. It's in the documentary, it's framed as a long and terrible, almost traumatic experience designed to test your mettle and likely to produce awe. When you go up north as a Canadian, it's clear that you're going up against yourself. It's a test of your moral, physical, and emotional reserves. You enter and become part of a myth. It's not surprising that when that Glenn Gould documentary was made at the height of the Cold War in 1967, the idea of North immediately suggested associations with the Soviet Union. In the film documentary, the long and terrible journey up to our northern regions is described by one of the characters in the film, a salty surveyor named Wally McLean, as almost trans-Siberian, And in part for its meditation on what the Arctic of the future will look like, Canada's is imagined as a giant outdoor playground, while Russia's is imagined as a series of organized and rational Soviet villages that seem more science fiction, more dystopian than utopian. In fact, in the same year that Glenn Gould made the documentary film, in 1967, the Institute for the Study of the USSR published an article on the development of the Soviet Far North, which underlines several important conceptual differences between the Canadian and Russian Norths. So Canada's north is above us on the map. I use my cursor here, you can see here. While Russia's is both north and east. Moscow and St. Petersburg are somewhere over here on the map. Our north is remote. There's about 2,000 kilometers between Ottawa and Iqaluit, and it takes over 3 hours of flying time. Russia's subarctic and Arctic, which you can see on this map in the dark and light blue. The darker blue is the Arctic and the lighter blue is the subarctic, is actually on another continent, since once you get east of the Ural Mountains, you are geographically in Asia. It's also almost twice as far to get from Russia's European side to its eastern and then its northern side. It's 6,000 kilometers from Moscow to a place somewhere in the center of its Arctic called Magadan. And the fastest direct flight that you can take involves over 5 hours of flying time. So Russia's north and far north, which are located largely in Siberia, are truly a world away from the nation's political center. But more importantly, the historical development of this area in the 20th century is also a world away from the experience of Canadians, of the Canadian North and Far North in that same time period in the 20th century. What left the deepest mark on Siberia and Russia's Arctic was the Stalin era, and in particular, the Great Terror. So in the 1930s, two cultural extremes of the Stalin era came together and were amplified in the far north, leaving a contradictory fallout of both heroic nationalism as well as the dark legacy of the Gulag. The development of Russia's far north is synonymous with the expansion of the system of prison camps that resulted from the purges and were known as the Gulag, which is an acronym for government universal camps. The Gulag was governed under the Soviet department known as Dalstroy, which is an acronym for the main administration for construction in the far north. The population centers that exist in Siberia today were expanded and developed thanks to the growth of the infrastructure that was required to run the Gulag system. Resource extraction in the area, which has been so important to development in Siberia and especially above the Arctic Circle, was developed mainly with a labor force that was provided by prison laborers. Russia's unfinished transpolar railway, which stretches from Salihar to Igarka, is another legacy of the Gulag. And to give you an idea of the kind of numbers that we're talking about, an estimated 18 million Russians went through the Gulag camps between 1930 and 1953. To be sure, not all Gulag camps were located in Russia's far north, but the most infamous were. At the same time, a contradictory narrative of heroism and adventure was developed in association with the Arctic and the North Pole in the exact same period, in the Stalinist 1930s. As historian John McCannon puts it, the 1930s witnessed the most systematic and all-encompassing sequence of Arctic expeditions in the history of polar exploration. In little more than a half-decade, Soviet explorers, pilots, and scientists made history in the Arctic many times over. So what were some of these heroic feats? In 1933-34, Soviet scientist Otto Schmidt led an expedition for the first nonstop voyage along the Northern Sea route from Murmansk to Vladivostok. While this revolutionary endeavor failed when the ship was encased in sea ice and eventually sank, an even greater revolutionary feat was pulled off by Soviet pilots who pulled off a daring rescue of all the expedition members from the polar ice. And all of the members who were on the ship, as well as the pilots, all were awarded the medals as heroes of the Soviet Union. In 1936-1937, the Soviet pilots Valery Chkalov and Mikhail Gromov made a series of non-stop, long-distance transpolar flights in the Arctic, culminating in their world record for the longest non-stop flight in 1937, which took them all the way from Moscow to Vancouver, Washington. That must be the other Vancouver, via the North Pole. In the same year, 1937, the Soviets made the first successful aerial landing ever at the North Pole and established the first scientific outpost there, establishing a 9-month research station that was led by scientist Ivan Papanin that you can see in the photo here. The Papanovites, as they were known, became Stalin-era celebrities in the press, and the feat of conquering the Arctic saturated popular culture in Russia to the point that it was featured in 1940 in a well-known children's story, actually a Soviet fairy tale by Valentine Cathayevs, which is called The Flower of Seven Colors. And in this tale, the heroine, who is a little girl named Zhenya, wishes herself to the North Pole with one of 7 petals of a magical flower in order to prove to the little boys who are playing Arctic explorers and won't let her play with them that she too can be a real polar adventurer. In the fairy tale, this is framed as one of 6 unworthy wishes that she wastes, saving the last petal for a worthy wish to bring good health back to a little boy in the neighborhood who has an injured leg. So this is a fairly typical fairy tale plot, using the unworthy wishes for pride, greed, and selfishness, and the worthy wish for helping others and out of selflessness. But it taps into some of the high points, including Arctic heroism of the era that were inspired by one of the famous mottos of the era, which is, "We were born to make the fairy tale come true." I give these examples to show that Russia's far north was shaped in terms of its cities, in terms of its industries, in terms of its resource development, by a dark past that remains one of the most difficult memory legacies of the Soviet period. At the same time, it's associated with a series of heroic feats that spotlighted the Soviet Union and launched it onto the world stage. And in case all of these things appear to be examples of the long distant past, Valentine Cathayevs' The Flower of Seven Colors is the book currently given out all over Russia with Happy Meals at McDonald's, and a postage stamp featuring Ivan Papanin's Arctic camp at the North Pole was put out in 2019 to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the feat. So anyone in Russia who was eating out or mailing a letter in recent years would have had occasion to remember these moments that highlight its Arctic past. Any discussion and negotiation between Russia and Canada on the Arctic would need to be informed by this cultural context. Russia will be looking to the Arctic to make new scientific advances, building on its legacy of heroic world firsts while seeking to overcome the darker legacy of its Stalinist past. If the Arctic was Soviet Russia's land of tomorrow, to quote the name of the Arctic Pavilion as it was called at the 1939 World Fair, which was hosted in New York, it's become very much the land of today. Putin has drawn attention to the Arctic with high-profile visits to the area. You can see here, this is him climbing a glacier and him looking at glacial ice, and with the declaration of 16 new national parks in his terms of office, the lion's share of them located in the North or the Arctic, including the massive 1,426,000 hectare Ruskaya Arctica, or Russian Arctic National Park, which was established in 2009. After it was given national park status, Russian Arctic National Park was greatly enlarged in 2016 to encompass both land and marine territories. If Russia's first Stalin-era period of Arctic exploration was about conquering the skies in transpolar flights, this one is going to be very much about the Arctic's marine territory and laying claim to the ocean, and the ocean floor, as well as laying claim to coastlines. That goal was symbolized by the second planting of a Russian flag at the North Pole, this time in 2007, on the pole's ocean floor. In a 2011 article published by the Arctic Institute, Annalise Guess questioned the motivation behind Putin's declaration of Russian Arctic National Park in what is an almost uninhabited area. She charges that Putin's real motivation was not ecological preservation, but in fact, the marking of sovereignty. Yet Canada did the same thing in the Arctic archipelago when it declared regions of Ellesmere Island, which has a population of 190 citizens total, as Kootenai National Park. The blossoming of Russian national parks and protected areas around the North and Arctic are certainly motivated by a mixed agenda of ecological and territorial concerns. Most of the national parks that were declared by Putin play the role of guarding the border, not just in the Arctic, but in the parks that he declared in Karelia, which guard the border with Finland, and in the Altai Mountains, which intersect with Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China. Canada is similarly drawing its borders in bold with its newest and largest marine conservation area, which is located in Lancaster Sound, just off Baffin Island, also in the Arctic archipelago. At 108,000 kilometers squared, the newly designated Talaruptup-Imanga National Marine Conservation Area is the largest protected area in the entire country, larger than any of our existing national parks. Jasper, Banff, any of them. And you can really get a sense of that when you see this map of Canada, and then you see the area that Talaruptup-Imanga constitutes. So this National Marine Conservation Area has at this moment gone through all of the feasibility steps and is awaiting the last step, which is an act of Parliament to make it official. It's also the result of fairly recent legal mandates that recognize the strategic importance of our coastline, particularly our Arctic coastline. Canada's Oceans Act was created only in 1996, and the Canadian National Marine Conservation Area Act only in 2002. But the expansion of a marine conservation system remains a work in progress and has only recently gained momentum. A majority of Canadians saw asserting sovereignty claims in the Arctic as the #1 priority of our foreign policy in an opinion poll that was carried out by the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs in 2011. The same poll confirmed the view that Arctic security is dominated by issues relating to sovereignty and border disputes, that there's a high degree of consensus among Canadians on the symbolic and public policy significance of the Arctic, and that the Arctic is a cornerstone of the Canadian national identity. So Canada shares the same motivations as the Russian Federation to both protect and lay claim to Arctic land and marine territories, to mark them as special, untouchable, and ours, and both nations are beginning to recognize the value of achieving those goals through less conventional means by declaring protected areas and national parks. These moves may intelligently serve the two most compelling needs of the Arctic as polar ice continues to melt and year-round sea traffic becomes a possibility where once it was an impossibility. Through these designations, we can fend off overfishing and disturbance of marine life and whale populations by claiming Arctic areas as territorial national coastline and waters, where we are able to enforce our own laws and regulations. Further, the understanding of our Arctics as two giant recreational ecological preserves ties into the Canadian cultural imagining of the far north as untouched wilderness and our giant outdoor playground, and Russia's need to turn the page on the dark past of its far north while connecting to its history of scientific firsts and adventure heroism, making it possible for networks of Arctic national parks to resonate with both core national identities. This approach not only brings Canada and Russia together as allies with common goals, but may help to shape an approach to the Arctic that achieves the aim of marking sovereignty through ecological rather than through military means. If both nations continue to nurture this path to managing the Arctic, Canada and Russia may be able to find enough common ground to steer them through the stormy waters of this latest crisis in their bilateral relations. Thank you very much. That's the end. I'm going to stop the share now.
Thank you very much, Megan. That was fascinating account of the kind of cultural context with which, through national lens, the Arctic is viewed in Canada and Russia. As a political scientist, I'm more used to thinking about these relationships in terms of power and interest, right, in international relations. But I think you gave us a very vivid account of how these narratives about claims of sovereignty, they're couched in a cultural context, right? And they, in terms of making, assigning meaning to territory, like the Arctic. And was, to be honest, it was really enlightening for me to realize how central the Arctic is in the national narrative of Canadians in this respect.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Now I know where my daughter's wish to go up there comes from. All right, it's all subconscious national identity in Canada. No, thank you. That was great.
That's right. Thank you so much, Oliver. And you've highlighted the fact that something that I was really interested in bringing this talk to you and to this crowd today, to this audience, is I was really hoping to address a group who are largely political scientists and have experience analyzing world politics, and to really try to fit in, really try for me to see how cultural studies and analysis of cultural representations can inform those types of areas. So I'm very interested in your feedback and to everyone's feedback on how that went. That was a concern of mine.
Thank you very much. If you could please use in the chat room, or raise your hand, or let me know if you have a question, and then unmute your mic, and if possible, start your camera. That'd be great. Who wants to start us off? Nicole, go ahead, please.
Hi. Hi, Megan. Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about, so you presented both Canada and Russia as, or implied them as, kind of a homogenous state. And we know that there are several Indigenous groups in the North who might challenge that idea of, and so I'm wondering if you could speak to that in terms of how that plays out in Russia and Canada, and how that kind of affects or influences the relationship between the states.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I was really hoping to hear from you because I know that your project also focuses on the Arctic. So anything that you have to contribute will be much appreciated from me. But I alluded to this just very, very briefly at the beginning of my talk in just one sentence, I think, about how decisions for Canada and Russia in the North have affected territorial claims for First Nations groups and also language rights for First Nations groups. And I'm actually better informed about the Russian context than I am about the Canadian context. But another thing that draws Russia and Canada together, and in terms of commonalities, is that relationship between central government and First Nations groups. And it's absolutely been a history of colonialism, which needs to be fleshed out as part of any research project dealing with the Arctic, and also racism. So I mentioned that Russia has numerous First Nations groups that are living above the Arctic Circle. And so some of the issues that are in common with Russia or with Canada, sorry, are the settling of nomadic groups. So in Russia, there are several Indigenous groups that are reindeer herders by tradition. And one of the things that Soviet policy did was try to establish national territories for these Indigenous groups, so not allowing them to have their traditional areas of migration anymore, but firmly settling them in one kind of bordered area, like almost putting a fence around them. And then the anti-religious campaigns, like Russia was an officially atheist state, also affected cultural traditions like shamanism, which were essentially destroyed at the same time as in the same years that practice of religions like Russian Orthodoxy and Judaism were being destroyed. In the Canadian context, I think it would be important to look at the history of residential schools, right? Of kind of destroying traditional values and traditional belief systems. I think there is a lot in common between how Canada and Russia interacted with their First Nations groups in the North. And then language rights would be the other major one. The enforcement of a speaking of a lingua franca, which would, in the Russian case, would be Russian. The Soviet case would be Russian, and in our case would be English. So I think there's a lot to investigate there.
Okay, thanks. I'll just make one comment about what I heard in our project. So the Borders and Globalization program had we had different regional focuses, and one of them was in the Arctic. It was led by Heather Nicol at Trent, who works closely with Whit Lackenbauer. Yeah. And she has several, and I mentioned this before, but she has several contacts in the Nordic countries as well, in Finland, in Sweden, in Norway. But one of the things we heard, so we hosted a summer program in the North that was called Borders in the North or something like that. And it was in Whitehorse, so not quite the North. If you're in Whitehorse, it's not the North. But one of the things that we heard very frequently was about Southerners making policy or setting policy or bringing in research programs on the North. Yes. And there was a real pushback from that in terms of, I mean, I think people are doing better now, but in terms of kind of not just Indigenous knowledge, but Northerner knowledge. Mm-hmm. Those were just like that was just something that struck me in terms of Canadians might think of themselves as a cultural identity with the North, but those who live in the territories, settler or not, certainly don't share the same understanding of Canadians as Northerners.
Absolutely, and I think that there's also a strong tie between the self-representation that I alluded to in popular culture, in books and in songs and so on, and self-governance, like right? It's like they're both impositions. They're both cultural impositions on Indigenous groups, or as you point out, on Northerners in general.
I can send you a list of our contacts from that program, from our project. Anyways, that was wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And Maeva just sent around a link to the Arcticsa Resilience Forum that started recently. Maeva, do you want to speak about this for a sec?
Yeah, great talk, Megan. Thank you. Yeah, I just found out about it yesterday, actually. So it's the Arctic Resilience Forum. And at first I thought it was like a 2-day intensive thing, but no, it's over 10 weeks and it's like an hour and a half. And they cover various topics around resilience. And this morning was youth, Indigenous youth leadership. And they had a 7 youth panel and, you know, youth from Russia and Greenland and Norway and Canada, and they were all talking about different initiatives that they were doing or crisis in their countries. And there's actually someone about reindeer herding, and so very interesting. And they will talk about infrastructure, food security. There's different topics every week. So I shared the link, and it's recorded too. So very interesting stuff.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And another virtual forum that I should mention in connection with some of the topics that I mentioned today is it's a 2-day forum that's going on at Norwich University today and tomorrow, and it's called the Weaponization of Water, which I thought was very interesting. So it's certainly up and coming, this idea of how to protect our coastlines.
Wow. Do you have a link as well that you can share later?
Yeah, I'll try to, I do have it.
Great.
Chris, would you like to come in?
Yes, if you don't mind, that'd be great. Thank you
Please.
for the presentation, Megan. I guess I have more of a comment. A colleague and I went to Whitehorse last year around this time with an express view of setting up a new CIC branch. And we met with a lot of people in Whitehorse, and I have folks in place, and we were all set to launch, but then COVID-19 came in. So we've kind of postponed things for now. But what really surprised me, I guess, I'd been up to Whitehorse many, many years ago, but what really surprised me this time around, for example, was the fact that they had 3 Starbucks in Whitehorse. And I know it's not the Arctic, but I was quite surprised. But more seriously, of the 30,000 people in Whitehorse, some 3,000 were Filipino Canadians, and a community that had, for example, saved the Roman Catholic Church, which was practically on its way out in Yukon. But with the influx of Filipinos over several decades, now forming a very large community there. And it wasn't something that I would ever have thought about. And then I was surprised by meeting so many diverse people that now call Whitehorse home. Alongside, across the road from a large Indigenous community center is a mosque. Again, not something that would immediately come to mind. And then on an airplane ride with a young man from Pond Inlet, he was telling me how happy they were to have a Tim Hortons in Pond Inlet, which is quite remote. But I guess all of this sort of spoke to me about most of my life has been concerned around security issues in the North, military issues, patrolling the skies and the oceans and whatnot. But in actual fact, there's a lot going on a day-to-day basis that we really don't think about. Mm-hmm. This is our country, but it seems like it's a million miles away. And I was just surprised by the dynamism that I saw in my little 1-week visit to Whitehorse. And we definitely in CIC take this seriously. We want to have a presence up there because we know that things are going on and they have to be part of the overall conversation that we have. So anyway, those are just a few little things that I just wanted to share with the group.
I think that's so true what you bring up, Chris, that our imagining of the North doesn't include certain things, like, for instance, the presence of a Filipino community, right? Like, so all that we have certain images in our mind that are that require some myth busting, I think.
Yes, well, the young man originally from India who does the Bhangra dancing that he was here in Victoria. He lives in Whitehorse and gave me a lift in his car from one place to another while we were meeting with people up in Whitehorse. And you also understand, you begin, things that we take for granted, how expensive the internet is there. A lot of people brought that up to us, just saying how much it costs to stream Netflix, and in the rest of Canada, you guys are living the good life, although we would think not. We think it's expensive. So just poking around there for those few days, almost a week, really opened my eyes. And of course, that's Whitehorse, it's not further up. And I have been to Tuktoyaktuk and Iqaluit and other places, so it's not totally alien to me. But I was surprised just to see how development is beginning to push its way up throughout the Arctic.
Mm-hmm. Chris, I'm wondering, since not everybody knows you yet with the new cohort of fellows, do you very briefly want to introduce yourself? Because you referred to your experience also with the military up there.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not in Turkey, which the picture behind me might make you think. I spent just, about 36 years in the armed forces. But I'm a combat arms officer, and I served in Afghanistan. I served in Turkey, but I also weirdly have a PhD in development theory, which makes for an interesting combination. Of course, I look after the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria. But in my travels in the Arctic over the years, it was mostly pop-in visits to different communities as a group of military people to get a better understanding of what we were seeing up there and what we could then come back and discuss about these things. In 2006, 7, 8, I was the deputy director of the team that wrote the Canada First Defence Strategy. And of course, it had an Arctic component to it. And you may recall when Stephen Harper's Conservatives came into power in 2006, they came in with a Canada First agenda, which included big investments in the Arctic, a refueling port. We were going to relocate some military units to the north. We were going to build icebreakers, offshore patrol vessels, and whatnot. We were going to renew some of the NORAD installations that are in the north. And we were going to buy the F-35 fighter, which would allow us to move about in the north quickly and perhaps more efficiently than what we currently have. Anyway, we then had the crash. The economy crashed, as you know, in 2008, 2009. We had a $56 billion deficit back in 2009, which seems like peanuts today. But it made a lot of those projects fell by the wayside. And we never saw the movement of military units. We saw the odd exercise. The refueling port was never built. We don't have the new fighter jets. And we're just starting to see some of the offshore patrol vessels with small ice breaking capabilities coming. So, you know, and funny thing is, I was on a call this morning with the Chief of Defense Staff talking about the Arctic and the fact that we have high hopes for the rebuilding that presence in the north, but at the moment it's a challenging time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, who wants to lead us into another question? Angie, please.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for your talk. I just found it really interesting as a newcomer to Canada. I've always seen in those downtown tourist shops like True North merchandise, and I had no idea what that was referring to. I think I understand it a little bit better now, but yeah, I was really interested in your use of films and stories. And you mentioned right now this idea of myth busting. So kind of how, in terms of how you set up your presentation, I'm curious if are you suggesting that kind of the conversations around preservation now are just like a more recent iteration of this kind of narrative or storytelling about the North? I was wondering if you could just comment on that, and whether those, I know the film that you mentioned is a little dated, so do those sorts of narratives still exist in popular culture now? So just would like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Angie. Yes, I think Oliver alluded to this as well, as somebody who immigrated to Canada, that maybe you didn't see this side of our Canadian, our feeling of our birthright with the North at first when you came. It's something that I think it is something that we do share, but it's a very interesting aspect of our national identity, because, like I mentioned, most of us have it without ever having set foot in the North. And I'm not sure if there's any parallels to other countries there. In terms of Angie, what you were asking about whether the ecological, I think what you were asking is whether the ecological preservation is, that's something that I would need to look into in connection to Nicole's question, which is how does a central government or Southerners kind of set the agenda for the North? So whether the declarations of these huge swaths of land are the material that I read, I had some insider help because my husband is a national park warden. So he was showing me the maps, and Parks Canada has some really beautiful promotional material about these new marine conservation areas. In reality, there's almost no regulations at all. They exist on paper, but they're not enacted in real life. And there's a lot of it's aspirational. These areas are aspirational more than real. And in these beautiful promotional pamphlets about our new national parks and new national marine conservation areas, they have a very strong Indigenous presence, right? Like beautiful pictures of people opening the park. And the reason that I knew how to pronounce Talaruptup Imanga is because they'll teach you in the promotional videos how to say the name properly. But whether that is just like a cover, right? Like a surface version, or whether that's something that's actually that local communities feel is needed, whether they were initiated at the ground level, that's something that I think would be really important to look into. And then to address the second part of your question, this Glenn Gould documentary from 1967. So Canadians generally all know Glenn Gould. I think he has an international reputation as well. But I'm pretty sure that most Canadians have never watched this documentary, The Idea of North, which is really experimental and kind of strange. I really recommend it, especially for those reasons. Really experimental and kind of strange.
Is it easy to find? Is it online or?
It's on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I'm curious.
Just Canadians in the crowd here, want to tell me if you have ever seen this Idea of North? Yeah.
I think I need to complete my socialization as a new Canadian as well. So, Ross, sorry, Megan, I don't want to interrupt you.
No. So I think that it absolutely taps into some of these myths that I'm talking about, but I think it was not, that particular one was not part of popular culture. It's part of an elite culture.
Okay.
And more recent examples, absolutely, but they're continuing on these same. I haven't seen a real turnover in these images of the North, but I wanted to. I know that there's some other questions, but I wanted just talking about this myth busting. I know that Will is on the call here. And hi, Will. And Will is our is a specialist in the Arctic, and he's done some really interesting work about perceptions of the Arctic that are inaccurate, especially focusing on what I remember from his work, from his presentation at the conference last year, was that most people in the Arctic are actually live in large centers, or in population centers, and our image is that they're living on alone on the snowy drifts. So I thought maybe Will wanted to jump in here and talk about misrepresentation.
Maybe we bring in Will now, and then we go to Rod with a question earlier. But I think it's a good segue, Will, to bring you in.
Sure. Sorry to skip the queue, but I did.
No
Timing. Hi, Megan. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. To the point about population centers, yeah, this is just something I find really a useful myth to correct for people, right? There's a perception on the one hand that the Arctic is unpopulated, which as you suggested, is obviously not correct. But even when people think about Arctic communities and where Arctic residents live, they tend to think of really small communities, and in the Canadian case, often very inaccessible communities. And while, of course, those do exist, they may be self-evident, but they have very small populations. So that's not actually where the majority of residents in either the Canadian Arctic or certainly the circumpolar Arctic live. People tend to be concentrated in the larger centers. And so, quite large cities in the Russian Arctic, Murmansk and Archangelsk and others in Northern Europe. And then even in Northern Canada, the three territorial capitals have the lion's share of Northern Canada's population. So yeah, definitely a myth worth busting, I think. And it's actually exactly on that point that I was going to ask a question of you, if I may, which is the Stan Rogers point that you made is to me such a great one. I've used that song to teach when I talk about precisely this, myth busting in the Arctic. And what I find interesting is it's such a well-known song and people associated with the Arctic, even though it, in my view, is only like a tangentially Arctic related song. He really uses the Northwest Passage as a metaphor to segue into that other great Canadian trope, the Trans-Canada road trip, which is actually what he's talking about. He's talking about moving west. He's talking about driving across the prairies. And so the Northwest Passage is being utilized or instrumentalized to make a quite different Southern Canadian story. And I think that's so telling. I think that is such a emblematic of the way in which a lot of Southern Canadian attitudes and perspectives and media and cultural production do use the North. And so the question that I have for you is a little bit more on the Russian side, because what I would suggest is that in Canada, as the Arctic has transformed in the last, years, but also decades, around questions of Indigenous politics and greater Indigenous autonomy, around climate change and, the really profound transformation that entails, I feel like Southern Canada and Southern Canadians are still frequently using the Arctic to tell stories to themselves, but I think we're telling somewhat different stories than would have been the case 40 years ago or 50 years ago or earlier, right? That there isn't, it's not a static object. And I'm wondering what you would say about the Russian stories that are told about the far north and the far east. Are they more or less similar to the kinds of stories that might have been told during the Soviet era in terms of Russian power and prestige, in terms of the resource extraction piece, or is there a different narrative or different account of the role of the Russian Arctic or of the Arctic writ large for Russia as a result of those kinds of changes, or has it perhaps not changed as much or in the same ways, or whatever you have to say? Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I'm so glad you brought up the Northwest Passage, because the only part of my paper that my husband objected to was the fact that I said it's still sung at top volume in pubs across the Maritimes, and he insisted that it's sung at top volume across Canada.
I think I have to side with your husband on that one, to be quite honest.
So you're absolutely right to bring attention to the appropriation of the North, which is what has happened culturally in terms of Southerners taking the image of the North, including Stan Rogers. He's using it as a metaphor for a long and painful, arduous journey. And he, not that driving all the way across Canada isn't a long and painful, arduous journey, but to compare it to the Northwest Passage, which obviously elevates that. I think to your main question about the Russian context and how it's moved since the Soviet period, I do see a change. So a lot of my research in the past has focused around the Stalinist 1930s. And at that time, the cities that are now population centers in Siberia were just starting to be developed. And a lot of them, because they were associated with the Gulag, which was a kind of a hidden aspect of life, even though millions of people were going through it, it wasn't publicly acknowledged. It wasn't fully understood by the public exactly what was happening beyond lots of people disappearing. And that's how the secret police did it. A lot of people just disappeared in the middle of the night, and then that was it. You didn't see them again. But a lot of these cities were so-called Soviet closed cities or secret cities. And for instance, Magadan, which is a city that exists only because of the Gulag archipelago, had to actually apply for the right to be called a city. And this happened like in the post-war period, and it got the right to call itself a city, and it got itself a theater, and a publishing house, and all the kind of the cultural accoutrements of a civilized city, to serve the, you know, kind of the spouses and the children of the people who had come to serve like were working in the Gulag system in the administration. But now that's a matter of the past. So those cities have grown, and now they regard themselves not as closed cities, not as military cities in the case of Magadan, but as just residential centers. And another so that's a change from the past. But also in terms of how Putin has put such an emphasis on territory in his foreign policy, and in protecting the territories of the former Soviet Union. That's been an important geopolitical piece ever since the beginning of his terms of office. But I don't think it's been recognized how much yet, and I was trying to bring that out a little bit in the talk, how much he has done actually for changing the image of the Arctic to be associated more with these national parks, and bringing I was in part of the research that I was doing for this paper. It talks about how the Russian chapter of the World Wildlife Federation, the membership has gone up exponentially just because of the attention, just high profile visits of the president to the Arctic and protecting these areas. So I think that's a major change as well.
Thank you, Megan. We have two more questions, and then maybe we have them one after the other, and then we come back to a final reflection from you, Megan. So Rod is next, and then we have Keith. Rod.
Thank you very much, Megan. This is a fascinating set of questions. I wanted to pick up on this question of sovereignty through ecology and the possibilities for cooperation. This very interesting notion that we see Canada and Russia cooperating against perhaps interests put forward by the US and almost all the rest of the world wanting to get in somehow on the Arctic rush. But this question of cooperation and science, ecological, but more generally the focus on oceans. Oceans Networks Canada has facilities up in Cambridge Bay. It's been pushing citizen science as a topic around the Canadian circumpolar region, I guess. But I was thinking about, we have the Inuit Circumpolar Council, I guess it is, and there was the University of the Arctic. I'm just wondering how far this question of cooperation with Russia on oceans science and oceans issues could be a real vehicle for building closer relationships, and how far the cultures might provide a foundation for that cooperation, or there might be a barrier. The respective cultures and views of the North might be a barrier to that kind of scientific cooperation. It does seem to me there's real potential in the whole circumpolar region to that cooperation.
Yeah, thank you. I was also trying to draw attention to that potential, and I also took it as a given that less securitization and militarization was a positive, which actually I'm not sure if Chris would agree with me on that, but that was taken as a given in my or as an assumption, an underlying assumption. But I mentioned about the Arctic Forum, which is hosted by Russia, and the fact that in response to the crisis in Ukraine, Canada is not sending an official representative. That doesn't mean that nobody is going from Canada, right? We still have representation that's coming from or attendees that are scholars and scientists, and I think that this is, in this particular period, this is going to be the way forward. These kind of holding hands across a different border and kind of under the radar of global politics, which sometimes those are the relationships that are more longer lasting. we see a lot of kind of bombast happening in the headlines right now around Canada-Russia relations. But if we can, I think there is a great deal of potential for cooperation at a scholarly and scientific level. And if the times that I've spent in Russia talking to Russians, one of the first things that Russians say is that we have the same nature. That's what they say. We're the same. We have the same landscape, and that means a lot actually in terms of how we're formed in our national characteristics. Of course, there's some differences, but when you look at Russia, if you're a Canadian, you kind of feel at home because you feel that you're in a northern country. St. Petersburg, which is the former capital, is actually at the same latitude as Whitehorse. So to them, that's not even north, right? So I think there is a lot of potential for future cooperation based on scholarly and scientific cooperation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Keith, could I ask you to come in?
Yes, sorry, just finding the unmute button. Thanks a lot for the talk. I really enjoyed that and learned a lot. Having thought a little bit about Canada's relationship with the North, but never having thought about Russia's. It was a really interesting experience. And in fact, I want to loop back a little bit to Nicole's first question regarding Indigenous people and their presence or perceived non-presence in the North, and try to connect that to the kind of narrative focus of your talk, talking about national identities and stories of nationhood. And in Canada's North, of course, the perception of an empty Arctic is kind of a stand-in for the terra nullius myth more widely, right? The idea that Canada is empty and therefore there was nothing wrong with colonizing it, and which is also part and parcel of kind of differentiating our identity from the Americans as a supposedly peaceful colonizer. So I have this sense of how stories about a depopulated or non-Indigenous North fit into Canada's national identity. But I was wondering how that fits into national identity narratives in Russia and what the role of indigeneity is in Russian self-understandings of nationhood.
Thank you so much for that question, Keith. And it brings up something that is an important difference between Canada and Russia, and something that actually is very important for this this dark Stalinist past that I talked about, which is that Canada has now embarked on this this reconciliation policy fairly recently in the grand scheme of things. And Russia has not embarked on any kind of reconciliation policy, either with its First Nations peoples of the North or elsewhere. I mean, there was a great many like nationalities policy during the Soviet Union was a huge issue, they, first of all, nationalities were toted as part of the Soviet Union being kind of so diverse and something to be proud of, but at the same time they were very strongly Russified during this whole period. And so there's been no sense of reconciliation with the past as a government policy, either in terms of what political repressions of the past, and or certainly not in terms of relationships between the government and First Nations people. I think one of the another main difference would be that well, actually no, this might be something more in common. Russia would probably make claims that that through interactions of European Russians with the Arctic, First Nations people were civilized and advanced. And I think that that's probably something that's very much in common with Canada. And one aspect of this that's quite interesting is that the concept of oral cultures. So oral storytelling is the cultural tradition of Russia's northern peoples. And one of the focuses of early Soviet Russia was to bring literacy to everybody. and that was claimed as a civilizational advance, right, and a political advance. But at the same time, they destroyed by bringing literacy to everyone, and they claimed 100% literacy, and they actually had a like truly great success rate, bringing full literacy to the entire population. They destroyed these oral cultures. I mean, not fully. They still survived, and Russians also had a oral storytelling fairy tale tradition that was destroyed in the process. So some of these interactions are very, very interesting. Thank you for bringing
that. That is really interesting. And just to follow up on one point, something that occurred to me as you were talking is that I'm not used to thinking of Russia in the mold of a settler colony. But there's a sense in which it is. I'm wondering if that's, if Russia has a self-understanding of itself as a settler colony, or how that's thought of in terms of an origin story.
Yeah, that's really important as well. I mean, how the Soviet Union was governed was absolutely as a colonization of, like, there was 15 republics, right? So from the Baltics, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, down to the Kazakhstan and the Stans, as they call them, like very, very multinational, and absolutely like a colonial dynamic at work there. In terms of their understanding of it, now Russian cultural anthropologists working on it would certainly understand it that way. At the time, during the Soviet Union, I know.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Megan. We could have probably gone off here on a different tangent and, address a whole different issue. So it's just tribute to the richness of material that you've brought to us today, Megan. So thank you very much for this. As that was, really taking us up north and through a different lens. We've addressed the Arctic through, the border dimensions, through issues of security, resource development, also the ecological crisis, the global warming that affects the North and the Arctic more than other parts. But I think you added a crucial component here with your lens of looking at national narratives, of identity, of cultural practices that define how we look at the North and how they, well, probably in a competing way, define themselves. So let me thank you very much for the presentation today, and all of you for joining us. A wonderful discussion, and I very much look forward to seeing you again next week. We're currently thinking about how we can bring at least some of us together in a real sense, with some social distance, but let's see whether this works.